Hi everyone, welcome. So again, my name is Felix Knight. I'm the Technical Director for Lightware UK. I also have with me my colleagues Tibor and Phil.
Hi.
You can.
Hi.
So they're going to be in the background listening to your questions. So if you guys have any questions, please put them in the chat, and they'll make sure they get answered. So today's webinar is behind the scenes of DVI and HDMI and DisplayPort Part 2. Today we're going to talk about 4K signal management, the secrets of HDR, and HDCP principles and applications. Great. The session is going to be recorded, so after the webinar finishes, you'll get sent an email with a link, and you can keep on to that recording. Great. Let's get on with it then. So we're going to start off with 4K. So there are different definitions being used around these kind of higher resolutions. Technically, 4K is 1496 by 2160 and is a sort of cinema standard resolution. What a lot of people call 4K is really UHD, which is 3840 by 2160, which is effectively 4 full HD signals stitched together. So it keeps the same aspect ratio of full HD. So why do we want to keep increasing the resolution? Why does it matter? So in order to understand this a bit better, we can talk about how our eyes work. So the resolution of our eyes is not measured in pixels, it's measured in pixels per degree of vision. It's easy to imagine it like this. If an object is very close to us, then we see a lot of its detail, but if it's far away from us, then we can only see its outlines. Now, if we bring up a digital screen made of RGB pixels, let's say this pixel size is the limit of our eyes. At this pixel size, we can no longer tell two neighboring pixels apart. And let's imagine that we have another screen with the same size, which means the pixels are half the size. In these two cases, our perceived quality is the same. An average person's eye has a resolution of about 60 pixels per degree. It means that within one angle, we can tell apart 60 pixels. So really, we need to modify the title. It's not just the resolution that matters; it's the distance too. So this is something that's really important to understand when you start talking about going to these higher resolutions. Just using a higher resolution does not necessarily guarantee that your perceived image quality is going to be better. We need to consider the distance of where we're viewing from, and then the other side is the size of the screen. So this graph shows you how far you need to sit from a certain size of screen in order to differentiate between 4K, 1080p, and 720p. So how far does an average person sit from their TV at home? 4 meters maybe, sounds about right. So how big would the TV need to be for someone to see the detail of 4K at 4 meters? The answer is at least 110 inches, which yeah, that would be a very big display for home use. When full HD became a standard and people were designing workplaces as well as in the home, they figured out that the optimum viewing distance for a full HD display was about 3 times the screen height, based on the average size of the pixels. Now that we've gone to full HD, UHD 4K, that's gone in half. So you can see that by increasing the resolutions, the constraints and the demands to increase the size of the screen or get closer to the screen also rapidly increase. So when we're talking about 4K and UHD, which of today's most popular interfaces can carry this signal? Well, HDBase-T, HDMI 1.4, and DisplayPort 1.1a have a limitation of about 10 gigabits per second. So they can only carry 4K at 30 Hertz. Or, as we'll see in the next slides, there is a way that it can carry a 60 Hertz signal, but by using chroma subsampled. At the moment, the only two interfaces that can transmit a true 4K 60, 444 or RGB quality signal over one cable are DisplayPort 1.2, and now we have DisplayPort 1.4 as well, and HDMI 2.0. So if people want to have a 4K system using these older interfaces, HDMI 1.4, HDBase-T, or the older DisplayPort, they need to make a choice. If they want to have 60 Hertz to enjoy a fluid motion, they will need to sacrifice quality and use subsampling. If the fluid motion is not a problem, if they want to have the perfect quality RGB, they will need to sacrifice the frame rate and have a jittery movement. So let's take a look at what these drawbacks look like. In the previous session, we talked a bit about chroma subsampling already. Just to give a brief recap, you can see that with 444, every pixel has its own brightness and chromacity information. Then with 422, we're in the chromacity, we're sharing the color information between two neighboring pixels. And 422 is generally regarded as a visually lossless, professional level sort of quality. So by subsampling this information, we don't necessarily lose the quality. However, when we go down to 420 and we've got the four neighboring pixels sharing the same information, then that's when, in certain cases, you may be able to notice a difference, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. However, comparing them with regards to bandwidth, if we consider 444 to be the 100% bandwidth, we can compare the other methods to it. So with 422, we're halving the color channel, the color information, and that represents a third less bandwidth, so a 33% reduction that we're saving. And then with 420, it's even more, it's a 50% lower bandwidth. 411 is the same, but you can see that by reducing this bandwidth, that's how we can get what should be an 18 gigabit video signal to fit into a 9 or 10 gigabit interface limit. Typically, at the time when this technology was very popular, you saw this logo a lot. It was 4K 60 Ultra HD, but the asterisk is that it's actually using 420. There's another way to represent this and see this. So if we look at this image here, we've got the 3840 by 2160 full resolution in terms of the Y component, the brightness component. And by using 420, what we're effectively doing is we have the color component only in a 1080p resolution, and we just sort of boost that up and zoom into it. So we're not actually increasing the quality, we're just like zooming in. And then when we add them all together, we get the image back. So now I'm going to show you some images that will give you some examples of what this actually looks like. So here on the left, you see 444 and 420 on the right. Is it possible to see the difference here? Well, no, because this is a black and white image, so it's only using the Y component, so the color information is kind of irrelevant here. So these are going to be identical. However, if we add some color in here, I can show you the worst case example. Now with these two highly contrasting colors, you can probably see the difference now. So the text in the right-hand image is blurred. You can see it's kind of bleeding out into the green. However, this is, as I said, the worst case scenario. This is not something that would you'd normally look at, hopefully. So if we take some more common examples, here we've got a slide from Excel, and you can see 444 on the left, 420 on the right. So if we take a look at this and we sort of highlight some of the areas, in this particular area, you can see the gray arrow. They look the same on both sides because it's gray. It's not got any color. But you see that with the yellow and red objects, that there's a bit more of a bordering and there's a blurring at the edges. If we look at the red text on the white background, you can see some difference. However, it's a bit tricky because there's anti-aliasing being used anyway, so it's already being blurred a little bit. However, if we move out of these kind of software tools, this Excel, and look at a sort of a more dynamic photo, here we can see we've got 444 and 420. I mean, I'll go backwards and forth a few times, but I think most people would say it's pretty much impossible to see the difference, particularly if you consider the fact that this might be a still frame from a moving image. In a moving image, there's no way of this. A moving image of this kind, there's no way you'd be able to see the difference unless you could pause it and really analyze it. However, if we take a bit of a closer look, if we zoom in on some of this hair, you should be able to see the difference, but it's very, very slight. It's very hard to notice, and that's the reason behind this. Is the subsampling method is a lot more visible when you have two highly contrasting colors next to each other. You could think of the subsampling method as kind of like taking the average between two colors. It's not that, but you could think of it this way. So when these colors are highly contrasting and the opposite ends of the color wheel, there is no sort of average between them. However, if they are two slightly similar shades of the same color, for example, then it's much more effective. And usually photographs and movies fall into this category where you don't have these highly contrasting colors so much. The other part to talk about would be the difference between 30 Hertz and 60 Hertz. Normally at this point, I'd play a couple of videos showing the difference between 30 Hertz and 60 Hertz. I'm not sure that's going to work over the webinar platform, but the general idea is that 30 Hertz, when you have a moving image, the movement is not as smooth. So you can see it's very jittery. And then by going up to 60 Hertz, you get a lot smoother. And you know, if you're playing a moving image, not just showing a still picture or working like that, then 60 Hertz is probably worth the trade-off. So the conclusion is you kind of have to choose which format is going to be the best for your application. Nowadays, with HDMI 2.0 and DisplayPort 1.2, the products are out there. There's a lot more options. However, there's lots of legacy systems, and even still, you know, in terms of cost savings, HDMI 1.4 and HDBase-T products are still very widely used. And in these environments, you do have this choice that you can make between having a smoother animation, but sacrificing some of the image quality in certain applications, or by using a lower refresh rate and a higher quality signal. I mean, there are some people who feel 420 is perfectly acceptable. You know, a lot of stuff is streamed in 420. However, can it be said that it's a professional quality? Well, if you put it in that realm, then perhaps you'd at least want 422. Okay, move on to HDR. So HDR, high dynamic range. What are we talking about when we talk about HDR? in this context? What's the point of all of these improvements in the technology? Well, the goal is to recreate what we see in real life as accurately as possible. And the emphasis is on two things in this sentence. The first one is we. And when I say that, I mean human beings, so us using our eyes and our brains. And the second thing is real life, what the real outside world actually looks like. So if we want to accurately recreate something on a screen, we need to understand how the human eye works, and then we need to find some metrics to describe real life environments. So to recap, the viewing experience is defined by the resolution, which means the amount of pixels we have, the frame rate, which means the amount of still frames we project within 1 second, the dynamic range, which means the difference between the black level and the luminance, the color depth, which is how big or small the steps are between two nameplate colors, and the color gamut, that's mixed up, which means the amount of colors that are available. Please note the color gamut is not to be confused with the color depth. They're two different parameters. There's actually a third parameter, which is 3D, which kind of had its time in the sun. I don't know if many people are still buying 3D TVs at the moment. I remember when that was quite popular with the release of HDMI 1.4. It's not very popular at the moment, so let's forget about that for now. So what does HDR sort of affect? Well, it's these three components. So the resolution and the refresh rate are kind of independent of HDR, and you can use HDR with a full HD image and get a lot of the same benefits. So let's talk about the first one, which is dynamic range. So some people might think that HDR is just making the whole image brighter. That's not correct. It's actually about providing the extra headroom to highlight details. So if we take an example here, we've got this picture of Usain Bolt in SDR. Now, if we just brighten up the image, you can definitely see a difference, but you can't actually see any extra detail. However, if we go to SDR, HDR even, here you can see that there is extra detail visible in some of the areas which were bright, and if we take a side-by-side comparison, you can hopefully see the difference. There's more details in the brighter areas, and there's more detail in the dark areas because of this expanded dynamic range. Another example is this photo taken on a hill. Looks like the Yorkshire Dales and some guys with their Caterham 7 club. And here you can see the hill and the sky. Everything is visible. But with an SDR image, you will lose some of the detail in the sky. So the mid-range parts, the cars and the hills and the land, didn't change much. It's only in the sky where you've got that that brighter area where there's the detail. That's what's going to be lost. And if we put them side by side, you get a good idea of this. So where is HDR going to make a difference? You know, it could be this in this light bulb, maybe in a campfire. So it's really the brightest parts of the image is where typically you'll see the biggest difference. So now that we've seen a few examples, we can talk about what actual luminance levels of the real world are. So here we've got two photos taken from a Dolby white paper, which have some luminance measurement points. So in the cafeteria, we have some dark areas, you know, up in the ceiling, or mainly up in the ceiling, and under the chair maybe we've got between 0.25 and 15 nits. So nits is a measurement of luminance. But you know, if we have the light coming in from outside or in coming from the light bulb, we've got 170,000, 133,000 nits. So within that one scene, that one cafeteria, we've got a range between 0.25 and 170,000, and you know, that's quite a large dynamic range. On the right, we've got the outside, and you can see that even outside, anything where the sun is involved and the sun is being reflected, like off that the front of that car, we've got 300,000 nits. And again, so outside we're having to have a range between, you know, 15 for under the car, 185 on the stairs, but then also between 300,000. And the key here is that our eyes are very capable to, you know, see things in this environment and collect this light information. So, is it enough to just buy the latest TV and enjoy the benefits of HDR? Unfortunately not, it doesn't work that way. So on the left, you can see the original scene we capture using a camera. Expensive cinema cameras can capture color very accurately and have a very wide dynamic range, so the problem isn't really on the camera side. And the TVs on the other side aren't really the problem either. Plasma, LCD, OLED TVs all have good dynamic range and color capabilities. That's not a new thing. The problem is in between, with delivering the information from the cameras to the TV screens. In a SDR ecosystem, the dynamic range and the color information is severely clipped and compressed during the post-production process to get it into enough bandwidth that can be transported either over broadcast networks or put on DVDs and Blu-rays. So the problem is, no matter how good your TV is, it cannot put back this lost detail into the signal. So the idea behind HDR is to use an entirely new HDR ecosystem throughout the whole signal chain. So we can keep that extra color information and dynamic range in the signal so that when it's received by the HDR compatible TV, then you can enjoy these brighter highlights and the lifelike colors. So we talked a little bit about what the real world is like, and we can show a little bit of how the human eye works in this dynamic range. So we've got a scale that goes from a few 100,000 nits, which can be experienced during a sunny day, down to a few hundred nits, which is, you know, normal for an office environment, for example, and it will go down to very dark values, you know, like at nighttime. So the human eye has evolved to handle all of these brightness levels, but we can't use this range all at once. We can adapt to dark environments, and then we can adapt to bright environments. So if you go outside and it's bright, you might get dazzled for a little bit, but your eye will quickly adjust. And if you go into a dark room, again, your eye adjusts. It actually takes a little bit longer to adjust from dark to light than it does from light to dark. But the idea is you've got this available range, and you can move it up and down this kind of this brightness levels. So now that we can see what the human vision sort of is capable of, so the dynamic range within sort of one scene, let's compare that to some of the display technologies. So we have our CRT monitor, which can go up to 100 nits. That's what the phosphor-based architecture could do at that time. Then we have the iPads, which can go up to 400 or 500 nits. The reason for this is that the iPad should be able to work outside, so it needs to be a bit brighter to be able to see the screen. But the trade-off is that the dark level is also moved up, so the darkest black is still quite bright on an iPad. If we take our average LCD TV, they've got a brightness around 200 and 300 nits, and the blacks are a lot darker, you know, depending on what technology they use. And so an HDR display can go as high as 1,000 nits. Some will advertise more, but most of them are really pushing out around 1,000 nits. It also depends on the technology being used. in OLED, the darkness can go actually down to 0 because the light sources are the pixels themselves. So it does depend on the technology, but this is kind of the average. And so if we look at the viewer's preference and what the people who are working on HDR are sort of working to, we have a dynamic range that can go up to 10,000 nits. So the problem with the current standards, the current SDR standards, is that they were developed with the brightness and capabilities of CRT displays in mind. HDR's goal is to create a new set of standards based on the viewer's preference and to give it the user's experience that comes as close to real life as possible. And you can see the HDR standards and the viewer's preference more or less is exactly the same range as the human vision on the left-hand side. Another thing that's worth mentioning is the viewing environment. So the human eye adapts to the average luminance levels of your field of vision. So if you're watching a TV in a dark room, then your eyes adapt to whatever brightness the TV is capable of producing. But let's say you open the curtains and it's in a brighter environment. You may lose some of the detail on the image because your eye is adapting now to some of the other things in the room. You know, if you've got a bright sunny day and it's reflecting off things, then it might affect the viewing experience. So moving on, I guess, if we let's go through onto the color gamut now that we've covered the dynamic range. What we're talking about with color is reproducing what we see in real life. So what do we see in real life? Well, this is the CIE color diagram, and it shows all of the colors that the human eye is capable of processing. But how much should a display be reproducing? Well, there was a scientist called Michael R. Pointer, and he wanted to find out what the colors were in the real world. So he made the measurements on over 4,000 natural and man-made objects. He measured the wavelength of light that they reflected, and he found that the colors that we see out in the real world are all within this area. This is what we call Pointer's gamut. And as we can see, Pointer's gamut only actually covers 46% of this color diagram. So interestingly, the human eye can process much more colors than what it actually encounters in real life. The colors outside Pointer's gamut can be reproduced using LEDs, but those colors don't look natural to us. If we take an example here, does this picture look real? It certainly looks very colorful and inviting. However, this is what it actually looks like in real life. So the photo on the previous slide was oversaturated. We can see the colors, but it looks unnatural to us. Those are the colors you usually see if you walk into a shop and you want to buy a TV. What a lot of people will do in that situation is set the colors to the maximum saturation and try to make it pop as much as possible. Here you can see the two images side by side. So in this particular example, oversaturating the colors, you can tell it's not real, but it doesn't look too bad. However, if we use these same settings on a normal news broadcast and you look at their faces, you can really see the difference. So the goal isn't to use as many colors as possible and go outside of Pointer's gamut and use these unused colors. The goal is to really have accurate colors that match up with the real life experience as much as possible. So what are the different color spaces capable of? This black triangle is Rec 709 or sRGB from the SDR standards. And you can see we're only covering 70% of Pointer's gamut. So there are a lot of colors that you can't reproduce with Rec 709. However, with HDMI 2.0 and HDR, we have Rec 2020, and you can see that we're covering 99.7 pointers gamma. So with Rec 2020, we're basically at a point where we can reproduce all the colors we need, and there's no real point in going any further for now. You know, that 0.3%, I'm sure we can live without. Yeah, having seen a comparison between the two color spaces and different content, it's really a massive improvement. So the third important part of HDR is the bit depth. This is something we covered a little bit yesterday, but again, to look at it, you can see on the right-hand image, from the transition between the sort of white, light blue at the bottom near the horizon, going up to the darker blue at the top of the sky, we can see this color banding. So the problem here is that we don't have enough individual shades of blue to represent on this image. Let's say this is a 1920 by 1080 image, and so we've got 1080 lines going from the bottom to the top. If we're using 8-bit color, then we'll only have 256 different blues that we can use to make that transition. So it's natural that some of the blue, or some of the lines that are next to each other, are going to have to share the same shade of blue. By increasing the bit depth, we can see on the left that we get these much smoother transitions. So the non-deep color bit depth is 8 bits per color. That gives us 256 levels for each color component. If we increase to 10, then we get 1024, which is a big improvement. Some people may still be able to see the difference. However, if we then increase to 12 bits, you have over 4,000 levels, and it's generally regarded that that's invisible to the human eye. So going back to our CIE diagram and thinking this time about bit depth, it's worth looking at the different color spaces. So if we draw on our sRGB and the Rec 2020, so we've got these two color spaces, and let's start at the white point in the middle. And if we go from the white point to full red in sRGB, then we have 256 steps to do that. And so we're traveling a certain distance, so there's a fixed distance between those two steps. However, if we increase the size of the color gamut without increasing the bit depth, then we have to use the same 256 steps between the white point and now this much further distance to the red. So the two neighboring steps move further away from each other, so the color banding becomes more visible. In other words, if you increase the size of the color gamut, then really you're going to want to increase the bit depth as well. Otherwise, the banding is going to become more extreme. So the recipe for HDR is 3 ingredients: more contrast, more colors, and a higher bit depth. And the result is a new set of standards. So let's take a look at the competing, or some of the competing HDR standards at the moment. There's 4 major players. There's Dolby Vision, HDR10, Hybrid Log Gamma, and SL HDR1. HDMI doesn't support SL HDR1, so let's exclude it from our comparison. Dolby Vision is a proprietary standard, so everyone who wants to use it has to pay a license fee. HDR10, on the other hand, is an open standard, and the same with HLG, so anyone can use it. Dolby Vision has gone with the 12-bit color depth. HDR10, as the name suggests, has 10-bit color, and HLG is also 10 bits. But don't be fooled into thinking that the higher number is always better, because it also depends on the TV's design. A $10,000 HDR10 TV will look much better with 10 bits than a $2,000 Dolby Vision TV with 12 bits, for example. Dolby Vision is designed to go up to 10,000 nits of brightness, but that will most likely only be a theoretical value. Most displays will only be 1000 nits, which is the maximum of HDR10 and HLG. Dolby Vision is using dynamic metadata, which means that the dynamic range and tone mapping can be varied on a scene-by-scene or even a frame-by-frame basis. HDR10 was static metadata, so it has one dynamic range setting for the whole movie. And HLG does not have any metadata, which makes it backwards compatible with STR system. HLG is really just modifying the electro-optical transfer function. So without going into too much detail, that's the way it is enabled with this backwards compatibility. However, there was a recent change, so HDR10 went to 10 plus, and what did they do? They basically copied Dolby and went to a dynamic metadata format. So if we have a look at the source manufacturers from the consumer world, Voodoo is an online media company, and that is only Dolby Vision. Apple, Netflix, Amazon, they're going with Dolby Vision and HDR10. And then Roku, Xbox, PS4 are going only HDR10. So there's a bit of a format war going on at the moment. But it seems like a lot of people are going with let's support both at the moment. From the display manufacturers, HDR10 is mandatory with to support HDR, so it's not really worth looking at. The question is whether a TV supports Dolby Vision or not. This is the current list at the moment. So HLG is supported by YouTube for this backwards compatibility. And interestingly, for a long time, Blu-ray was only HDR10, but then they announced that they will also support Dolby Vision. So I guess there was some kind of deal made in the background. So these are just the technologies, but let's look a bit about how this affects the products. So the first area we're going to look at is EDID in dynamic range. How do all of these new features present themselves in the EDID? Well, there is a new data block for HDR, but they're actually the details are scattered around the whole EDID structure. So here we have the colorimetry, and you can see we've got the Rec 2020, so BT 2020 support. We've got an HDR data block that contains static metadata. In the HDMI vendor-specific data block, you can find the bit depth options, so supporting the right level of deep color. For higher bit depths, they also need to be supported in this block, the HDMI forum vendor-specific data block. You can actually see on here the SCDC present. That's also an important feature generally for HDMI 2.0, so that's always worth having. And the 420 subsampling is also indicated in the EDID. So to summarize, try not to mess with the EDID. It's best to dynamically emulate the EDID of the display that you want to use to get the best results. So let's talk about the bandwidth requirements and the signal management. So we know that the HDMI 2.0 bandwidth is 18 gigabits. That's what supports the 4K 60 RGB with 8 bits. But we've been talking about the higher bit depth for a while, so how does that fit inside this limitation? Well, if you're using 60 Hertz and RGB, then the answer is it doesn't fit. So there's a bit of an issue. How is this handled? Well, we have multiple options. The first one is not using HDR, which is not great. However, the second option, which is used commonly, is to use subsampling. So you can use 60 Hertz with the 422 and the 10-bit for HDR10. This is the way HDR10 works. But even with 12 bits using 422, you can go up to Dolby Vision with 18 gigabits And then if you really wanted to, you could drop the refresh rate and then get your 10 bits 444. So you might get some people who say that the 8-bit 60 hertz no HDR signal, because it's using 18 gigabits per second, must be a better quality than the 422 HDR 10-bit signal. And I can tell you from experience that's very much not the case. If you side-by-side content and one's 10-bit 422 and one's 8-bit 444, the 10-bit content's going to look better every single time. Just to look at some of the Lightware products that can handle these data rates. So currently we're using fiber optics extenders for HDMI 2.0. We have the OPTJ, which is kind of the plug-and-play version, and then the other is the rental OPTC, which has some nice features for the rental market. We also have switches, so this is our 8x8. We actually have larger frames as well, 16x16, 24x24, 32x32, and now 48x48. So we've got a whole range of different options with switching, some with just HDMI 2.0, some with DisplayPort 1.2. If you've got any questions about that, feel free to get in touch. So how does scaling and compressing affect HDR? Well, the HDR can be compressed without too much of a headache because it's sending the metadata in the info frames. So these are the packets of information that are embedded in the blanking interval, which we talked about yesterday. So that it can be scaled and compressed, and the metadata is normally sent alongside and unaffected. However, with Dolby Vision, it can be problematic. So HDMI 2.0 supported static metadata, but Dolby wanted to use dynamic metadata, so they came up with their own workaround. The metadata is actually embedded into the active video area. Scaling and compressing can affect this though, because they're lossy, which means that they can irreversibly modify the bit values, effectively damaging the metadata. It's not impossible to do. You can do it. It's just a bit harder. So that can be one of the considerations if you're thinking about deploying a Dolby Vision system. Maybe it's worth comparing the uncompressed and testing the compressed version and seeing if it actually produces the same results. Cool. Before we move on to HDCP, are there any questions on the whole HDR side of things?
Yeah. First one is, what is HDR's relevance to projection applications?
Okay, well, I would guess that you were with the newer projectors, the HDR compatible. That's where you're going to see the HDR sort of effect. I'd say that it's with HDR, you've got those three components: the high dynamic range, the color gamut, and the bit depth. I've seen a lot of applications where they don't have HDR content, or they don't have content that has the metadata, and so the dynamic range aspect of it isn't so much affected, but they are making full use of the increased color gamut and the increased bit depth, and that creates a very, even with 2 out of 3 of the available features, you're getting a much more improved viewing experience. But yeah, HDR is a phrase, or is a term that's been used for a while in various different contexts. So for cameras and video games, it kind of means something a little bit different to what we're talking about when we talk about it in context to HDMI 2.0 and signal transmission. But yeah, with regards to projection, if you have a new projector and you have HDR signal path, so you've got HDR capable devices all the way through, and you've got HDR content, then you'll be able to see the HDR through your projector. But as I mentioned, maybe that might not be possible depending on what equipment you have, but it should be possible to at least employ the higher bit depth and the expanded color space.
Next question, static versus dynamic metadata. How important is this?
I think dynamic metadata is generally regarded as better. It really, effectively, the people who are mastering the content and going through that post-processing process to take the raw content and turn it into either a file or a disk or whatever that you can actually play it from. With dynamic metadata, you're giving those people more tools effectively to kind of maybe some of it's a bit of artistic license, but it's the dynamic metadata is better because you don't necessarily the sort of brightness values that might work for some parts of the content might not work for other parts of the content, obviously depending on the content itself. Whereas so with a static metadata, it's kind of set up at the beginning and it might not change enough to cover what's required. Whereas dynamic metadata, the people who are mastering the content can say, okay, this scene's in quite a bright area, let's use these settings. This scene's in a sort of darker area, let's use that. I mean, if you can imagine opening up the brightness settings on your display as you're watching the content and manually adjusting it, that's the dynamic metadata effectively gives the people who make the content that kind of capability. So it's definitely better, but as you saw with HDR 10 going to 10 plus, I would imagine the static metadata is something that's kind of going to be phased out as everyone gets used to the dynamic.
Yeah, and I guess even that slight advantage doesn't matter. So if the content was mastered either with HDR10 or Dolby Vision, it's going to look great. Much better than having an SDR content and then just using post-processing in the screen to increase the contrast and the color gamut. It's going to look bad.
Yeah. Cool.
All right. And do video chips care about, I guess our chips care about actual HDR format, bit depth, and subsampling, or is it is the limitation just the bandwidth?
I believe it's on the sort of chip level. I guess they're kind of tied to each other, because if you've got a chip that can handle the HDMI 2.0 bandwidth, it's probably going to be an HDMI 2.0 chip, which will then support all of these HDMI 2.0 features. So they're kind of tied to each other, really. That's as far as I know.
Yeah. All right. I think we can continue.
Cool.
Thanks.
Let's go up. Cheers, Tibor. Let's go on with HDCP. So HDCP causes a lot of headaches, but the goal is to provide point-to-point encryption and prohibit the theft of copyrighted content from the cable itself, which is a strange one, but it's actually an encryption process developed by Intel, so it's a military-grade encryption. So HDCP encryption is the last thing that will happen on the source device, and the decryption will be the first thing that happens in the sync device. So the signal is either not encrypted at all in the source, or another kind of encryption is used. So it's really just inside the cable. It's also worth knowing that inside repeater devices like AV amplifiers or matrix switches, the signal is also not encrypted. So it's really literally just the cable. HDCP has 3 pillars. The first one is a complicated handshaking process. This ensures that only authorized devices can receive the protected content. All HDCP compliant ports have a set of public and secret keys, and all the ports in the world have different keys. So HDCP is point-to-point, so the connected input and output ports exchange their keys and come up with a shared key, which will be used to encrypt the data on that connection. And a different input and output port will share different keys. So the authentication process is based on receiving these public keys and making sure that they are valid HDCP keys. The second pillar is the encryption itself. So HDCP, as I mentioned, is a military grade encryption, and you'd need a supercomputer to break it. However, as we all know, there's much easier ways to get around it and get the content. You just need to put a Blu-ray disc in a computer and you can rip the content. So this is literally, the encryption is just inside the cable. The third pillar is the revocation. So HDCP LLC actively seeks out illegal devices and their manufacturers. If they at any time in the future find an illegal device, which is something that outputs a protected signal without the encryption, then they'll put the public key of that device on the newly manufactured Blu-ray discs, or they stream the revocation list over the internet. When you put that Blu-ray in your Blu-ray player, it will update the revocation list, or if you connect it to the internet, and it will check whether any devices that are connected are on that list. So if you're on the revocation list, you won't get any signal until you remove the illegal device. And from a manufacturer point of view, if you make one device which is considered illegal, HDCP might revoke the keys for all devices that were ever sold to you. However, we'll see what the status of all this is at the end. So only DCP, Digital Content Protection LLC, can generate HDCP keys, and manufacturers have to sign a contract with them in order to buy the keys and the chips. Of course, signing the contract, they also have to pay money, lots of money. DCP has the master key, which is used to generate the key, the public and secret keys, and we'll see what those are in a minute. As per the signed contract, it's a huge violation to make a secret key public, but even us as manufacturers don't have access to the secret keys stored in our devices. The keys are burnt into the chips by the manufacturer, and so we can't access them. They never leave the device. HDCP handshakes are always done by the chips automatically. And to make sure everyone obeys the rules, DCP LLC keeps a database about who has what keys and their owners. So yeah, they can manage what keys can be revoked and who has what. It's all handled by them. So people sometimes confuse EDID and HDCP. We can have a look at how these are communicated. Both are done on the low-speed bidirectional communication channel, the DDC. DDC is actually not point-to-point, it's point-to-multipoint. So there's a master device, which is always the source, and it controls all the communication. And so there can be multiple slave devices, and each of them have their own DDC address. So when there's an EDID memory chip inside the sync device, it has a certain address. And then the HDMI receiver chip, which has the HDCP on it, also has a different address. So when the source wants to read out the EDID, it addresses the EDID chip. And if it wants to perform HDCP handshakes, it addresses the HDMI chip. So no matter what the EDID might say about the HDCP capabilities of the display, it doesn't actually get involved in the process. And as we'll see later, with the HDCP communication, there can be benefits to manually shutting that off and effectively disabling HDCP. So the most important rule is that protected content can only be viewed on compliant devices. If a device removes the encryption and sends it to a non-compliant display, then it's considered an illegal device, and we'll see what the consequences are of that. So HDMI compliancy is more or less equivalent to HDCP compliancy. Maybe the very first HDMI displays or sources weren't compliant, but nowadays anything that supports HDCP basically also is an HDMI device. So if we take a quick look at what happens when we connect a source and a sink, and the source wants to send in an encrypted signal, first they perform the basic handshake that we saw in the EDID management part yesterday, and then each device has its public and secret key. So the public key is allowed to be sent over the cable, that's why it's public, but the secret key never leaves the device. So each HDMI port in the world has a different set of keys. If a TV has 3 HDMI ports, then TV has 3 public keys and 3 secret keys. So there's a lot of keys possible, more than 670 billion. So let's connect our devices. After the basic handshake, the source will send its public key and it will read out the display's public key. Then both devices will use their own secret key in a cryptographic process, so it's a mathematical process, and develop a so-called common secret key. Because the public and secret keys are generated from the same master key, when this process is done, you always end up with a common secret that's the same for both devices. The common secret is then used to encrypt and then also decrypt the data. Then the source verifies the connection, which means it checks that whether the common secret generated is the same on both sides. Then it will send the encrypted signal. And then to make sure everything's safe, every 2 seconds there's a link verification. At the moment, let's take the moment to talk about B caps and repeater devices. So B caps basically means the B device capabilities. So there's various elements to it. It's a 8-bit register that contains the following information. So can the B device communicate at 400 kilobits per second, which is a fast communication, or is it only capable of 100 kilobits? DDC was really designed to be used between the communication interface used by DDC was designed to be used between chips on the same circuit board. So we always recommend to use 100 kilobits per second maximum speed because fast communication can create problems through long cables. However, another important bit is whether the B device is a repeater. So we call matrices, switches, distribution amplifiers repeaters because they receive encrypted data. They decrypt it to be able to switch it and use it inside the device, and then re-encrypt it on the output. So they repeat the handshake encryption. When a B device is a repeater, it has to collect the public keys of all connected devices. There's another bit that indicates whether the public key list is ready or not. The repeater has 5 seconds to collect this information, but the source doesn't always want to wait 5 seconds, so it continuously asks the repeater whether the public key list, also called the KSV, the key selection vector, whether that's ready. So when this bit changes to 1, that means the list is ready. So it's worth noting that stuff like cable extenders are not always repeaters. If they have 1 input and 1 output and all they do is cable equalization, then they don't have to decrypt the data, which means they're not repeaters. But the interesting part is there is some element of control over whether a B device is a repeater. So that's something to consider. So if you've dealt with HDCP compliant problems and you've had HDCP issues, you've probably seen this kind of snowing. So in this case, the common secret is recalculated for each frame of the video. The device also uses pixel information for this recalculation. And when there are pixel errors in the transmission, what can happen is that the display uses the wrong pixel and makes a calculation error, which means that the common secrets will not match and the display can't decrypt the signal. So when you can't decrypt the signal, that's when you see this snowing. To make sure that this doesn't last too long, the source reads out the common secret after every 128 frames, more or less 2 seconds, and checks if it's the same. And if everything is okay, it continues, but if not, it does the handshake all over again, and then you'll see the normal image. So you might see this when you're switching inputs on some devices. You get a moment of this snowing, and then eventually, fairly quickly, the image comes back. So far that we just looked at the simple point-to-point handshake. However, as I mentioned with the B devices, we can have repeaters, and so we have a look at how this works with that. So the first step is the same. We exchange the public keys, basically do our HTTP authentication. Source verifies the connection, which is checking the common secrets, and then it checks whether the connected device is a repeater or not. So in this case, it is a repeater. So it must collect the public keys of all the connected devices and report them back to the source. And the topology of the system is also reported back. So that's, how many layers of cascading and what's connected to what. So the source now knows there are 2 levels, 1 repeater on the first level and 4 displays on the second level. It's very important to know because many people get confused. The source will not use the public keys of the display devices for the encryption. It just needs to know them for a different reason, to make sure everything's valid and you don't have a compromised device connected, for example. If everything checks out, then the source starts sending the encrypted video signal. The first step, the input port of the repeater encrypts it between itself and decrypts it inside the repeater. So internally, the signal is not encrypted because you can't distribute an encrypted signal. HTTP is point-to-point, so it wouldn't work. So once we have the unencrypted signal inside the repeater device, we can then perform the same process on each of the output ports between the output port and the display. And if everything here works out well, then it'll send the decrypted signal, and we'll get that into the displays. And then again, we have the link verification every 2 seconds. So that's how HTTP works with our repeater devices. We'll take a look at some of the limitations. The limitation that most people face is the number of public keys that a source can accept. The standard says a source should be able to accept a maximum of 127, so that's 1 repeater device and 126 displays. But the reality is different devices support different number of keys. So for example, the PlayStation 3 would accept 14 keys, Xbox 360 16, but we even had this one Panasonic Blu-ray player that would only accept 3 keys. So if you have more devices in the signal chain than 3, it will turn off its output. These limitations probably not intentional. The manufacturer didn't decide this or that. It's just the number of devices physically that the key could accept, and a lot of them are designed mainly for home applications where maybe you have an AV receiver and a TV or 2 TVs, but this limitation doesn't affect 99% of the customers. However, nowadays with the professional manufacturers such as Lightware, we have our devices designed to accept the maximum number of keys. One of the other limits is the number of cascades, so how many different repeater devices can the signal go through. The standard says that can only be 7 levels, and then the 8th will have to be a repeater. So if you have a repeater on the 8th, then the source will turn off its output and you won't get any image on any of the displays. Another important rule is that whenever the topology changes, it has to be reported back to the source as part of a new HTTP handshake. So if we have a system like this with 1 source from 1 repeater and 3 displays, we've already got the image on them, and then we connect a 4th display, that means the topology is changed and the HTTP handshake must start again. The problem is, whilst this is happening, the output of the source will be turned off. So you've lost the display on all. You've lost the image on all of the other displays. Once it gets the public key of the new monitor and it reports it back, as well as the new topology, then everything will be checked and it will turn the output back on. So this can take up to between 2 and 5 seconds. In the past, we had some other manufacturers where their HDCP matrices would perform new handshakes when you do crosspoint switches, which meant that every time you made a switch, all of the images would go off. So obviously that's a very undesirable outcome. And again, if you remove the fourth display, you've got another topology change, which means that has to be reported back. With Lightware devices, we have HDCP key caching, which kind of limits this particular issue. And then the revocation list. So effectively, as I mentioned earlier, there's a list of compromised public keys that gets loaded onto Blu-rays or downloaded into Blu-ray players through the web, for example. And if we connect the compromised device, the public key gets reported back. That's on the list, and so that's a problem. And so the only way to get the image to play again is to remove the compromised device and get that topology change update. So the revocation list should be something to worry about. However, we will see shortly how it's is there actually anything on the revocation list? That's a good question. So when we're talking about HDCP, we need to talk about Apple and Macs, because the way they handle HDCP can cause a lot of headaches. The problem with Macs is that they try to use HDCP whenever possible, regardless of what content's being played. Even if you're just showing your background, your desktop, if you connect an Apple device and it does the HDCP authentication, if it detects HDCP compliancy with the connected device, it will use HDCP. If you connect it to a non-compliant device, it won't use HDCP. If you tried to start playing protected content, it would kick in and it wouldn't let you see anything. But just for your everyday, day-to-day use, you can use an Apple device with a non-compliant HDCP display, no problem. If you connect an HDCP compliant display, it will detect that it's an option that's available, and so it will say, hey, why not? I like to use encryption. Let's encrypt the signal. The problem comes when you have a system that is comprised of not just HDCP compliant devices, but also non-compliant devices. This could be old monitors and displays, DVI only displays, for example. But it can also be stuff like video conferencing units. By design, a VC codec isn't going to be HDCP compliant because it would be broadcasting out the incoming input. So if you want to have your Apple device in an environment where you want to be able to share it to an HDCP compliant display, but also, for example, a VC codec in the same system, then you're going to have a problem. If we have a HDCP compliant switcher like our 8x8 DVI HDCP Pro, this is what we'd see. The Mac would be able to see that the switcher is HDCP compliant, so it would send encrypted content to the switcher. The switcher could send the encrypted content to the HDCP compliant display. However, to the non-compliant display, it wouldn't be able to show the image. In this situation, the matrix actually performs an intelligent action and shows a red screen on the display. So this red screen is a notification to the user that you're having an HDCP problem here. So what's the solution to this problem? Well, on the input port on pretty much every Lightware device that's HDCP compatible, we have the option to enable and disable HDCP. Effectively, what this means, going back to talking about the DDC channel and the memory addresses, when the connected device tries to do the HDCP authentication and it addresses that sort of HDCP memory address, our device just gives no response. So that's all that this checkbox does. However, it enables us to control whether the connected device sees our device as an HDCP compatible device. So in this case, now the Apple is sending an unencrypted signal to the switcher, and we can distribute that a lot more easily. I remember when we came up with this feature, it was solved a hell of a lot of problems for us, and I believe that most other manufacturers are supporting something like this now. So what if you have an already existing AV system that's HDCP compliant and you don't want to buy a new switcher? Well, all of this same functionality, a lot like with the EDID management, it's not just on the ports on our devices, but it's also in this standalone EDID manager. So what you can do is you can set the memory location to 01, hold down the learn button, and that status LED will change color. When it's green, HDCP is enabled. When it's orange, it's disabled. And we can just connect that in front of the HDCP compliant AV system, and we can still present to the laptop, the Apple device, an uncompliant or non-compliant display. So it's worth talking about some of the common HDCP problems. The most common is that you don't see any picture. So that could be several things. Maybe a non-compliant display is connected, or a non-compliant device is in the signal chain. There's a compromised device. More or less, these problems are that the source device is not sending anything out. So something has convinced the source device that this system is not HDCP compliant. You can't send HDCP into this system without breaking, the HDCP license agreement. The periodic snowy image is an indication that the source is sending out a signal, but the encryption process and decryption process is not working for some reason. This could be the unstable DDC connection, or you're using a low quality cable and you're getting these pixel errors. And as we mentioned, the pixels can be used in the encryption and decryption, and if they're not transmitted correctly, then you won't be able to decrypt the signal, which is another increased sensitivity that HDCP puts on the system. And then if you're seeing a red or any other color image, that's most likely your intelligent switcher sort of indicating that there's a problem. So we spent a lot of time talking about HDCP, specifically HDCP 1.4. However, there was an important piece of news. The HDCP 1.4 master key got published in 2010. So it was leaked or reverse engineered. We don't know for sure. I think some people were talking about some guys who got the HDMI chip and milled it down so the sort of top was exposed, and used a high resolution infrared camera to figure out what was happening inside the chip, and through that potentially reverse engineer the master key, which is a pretty impressive feat of engineering. It just gives an idea of how much people really hate HDCP and hate working with it. But the result is that using the master key, anyone can now create their own HDCP keys. So the whole revocation list is pointless. Someone could design an illegal device and using the master key, generate a public and secret key and put it into that device. And it may very well be that same public and secret key was put in a chip that was sold to Lightware. And so if the revocation list was activated and they found that device and say, oh, well, Lightware made this, let's revoke all of the Lightware keys, well, that would be breaking the other side of the HDCP agreement. So effectively, HDCP 1.4 is not a really secure thing anymore. It's more of a nuisance than anything else. So to combat with that, we have HDCP 2.2, which is the latest version being used. So let's see what's changed. There's 5 major changes that we're talking about. The first one is the encryption method. So it was using an XOR stream cipher. It's now changed to using standardized RSA and AES algorithms, which are considered to be more secure. Yeah, that's the kind of a very strong encryption. The next one is the maximum number of connected devices. It was 127. They brought that down to 31, just because they can. And the levels of repeated devices, it was 7, again down to 4. Then there are 2 new items. One is the locality check, which I will explain, and then the content types. So what is the locality check? It's a way of making sure that the protected content is not sent to a wide area, so it stays local. And to see how it works, the source comes up with a random number, and it sends it down the signal path to all of the HTTP compliant devices, and they must do some calculations on this random number and send the results back to the source. And the rule is that these results must arrive within 20 milliseconds. If they're late for whatever reason, the source may deny sending any content through. Which doesn't give much time for format conversions, and is generally, a pretty significant increased extra load on some of these devices to be able to handle this random number stuff. With content types, it's worth looking at the sort of progression from HTTP 1.1, 1.4 even. Jesus. So we had that, but then, as I mentioned, it got hacked. Someone published the master key, so they went to 2.0. That also got hacked immediately. 2.1 was published. Again, that one was hacked. So we have HTTP 2.2 now, which hasn't been hacked yet. But the content providers, the people from the sort of content producing side who also buy into HDCP, like Blu-ray and all of the movie studios, the Motion Picture Association of America, they weren't too happy paying for a service which kept breaking. They want their content protected, so they wanted a solution to this problem. And the solution that they came up with was content types. So there's 2 types, type 0 and type 1. Type 0 means that HTTP encryption must be used, but it can be any type of HTTP. So it doesn't, if your device supports 1.4, it can be 1.4. If it supports 2.2, well, the strongest possible encryption should be used. So if it supports 2.2, let's use 2.2. So when 2 devices are connected, they need to determine which is the highest version that they both support and then use that. Type 1 is the sort of high value content, which is where HTTP 2.2 must be used. It only applies to UHD or 4K content. And, if you have one device in the signal path that doesn't support 2.2, then you won't get any picture. But 1080p is not affected. So in that case, if you just drop down the resolution to 1080p, you should be able to view the content. And so we already have this with Netflix and its UHD contents type 1, and also UHD Blu-rays are type 1. So let's just look at a quick example. Let's say we have a system like this. We have a Blu-ray player, a Lightware MX2 matrix, a home cinema amplifier, and a UHD TV. All of the devices are 2.2 compliant except for the amplifier. We connect them all to each other. When you turn on, they do the handshake, they report back the keys. If we insert a type 0 disk, each link performs its handshake, and we use the highest version possible. So it's really the AV receiver that's bringing it down to 1.4. And at the moment, this is fine because we're using type 0, and we can get 4K through to the display. However, if we are using type 1, we'll have a problem. The public key from the HDCP 1.4 device will be detected. And so what happens? Well, in this case, the Blu-ray player makes a smart decision and it says, okay, I'll send 1080p because that's allowed. But that's no guarantee. On other devices like an Xbox One, you'll just get no picture. So what can we do to rectify this? If we disconnect the AV receiver, then we're getting HDCP 2.2 all the way to the display, and that's when we can see 4K. But what other solutions do we have to this? If we connect this this back up again, even though the signal's not going through the AV receiver, it's still reporting back that key. It's still part of the topology, so it's still a problem. So we can look at the different solutions by looking at the different HDCP modes we have with the MX2 matrix. The first one is disabling HDCP, which I kind of talked about before. In this case, because we're using a Blu-ray and it's definitely protected content, you're not going to get anything sent over. The other option is enabling just HDCP 1.4. As you might think, as before, you'll get the 1080p image, so it doesn't present too much of a different scenario than just having everything enabled. Enabling HDCP 1.4 and 2.2 presents the same problem again. You know, that HDCP 1.4 key from the AV receiver is getting reported back, so that doesn't present any different scenario. But we have another mode which is designed specifically for this. We call it the high value mode. High value mode means that we hide the HDCP 1.4 device from the source, but it also means that the matrix won't be able to send this particular signal to these ports. We actually asked HDCP LLC what counts as part of the system and whether a device that doesn't receive a signal from a particular source is allowed, and they confirmed that this is actually allowed. So if you don't switch the signal from the source to that AV receiver, then it shouldn't be part of the HDCP device tree, which raises lots of questions about the topology and all that. But in this case, that means we can send the 4K signal to the display without having to physically disconnect the AV receiver. It's worth just quickly mentioning that just because something is HDMI 2.0 does not necessarily mean it's HDCP 2.2 compliant. There was a brief period around, just before 2014 where there were HDMI 2.0 devices being made, but HDCP 2.2 wasn't ready yet. So these might not work with type 1 content, so it's just worth bearing in mind. Why might we disable HDCP 2.2? Well, if you know from the beginning that there's never going to be any high value content being played in the system, it might be worth disabling it, specifically because, as we mentioned, the limitations that it imposes are a lot more restrictive in terms of the maximum devices and even the locality check and that stuff. So if you can disable it, you can increase the number of max devices and not have to worry about the locality check. Great, that brings us to the end. Hope that was all clear and informative. And yeah, I got some time now just to go through some of the questions.
Yeah, we have a couple interesting ones. Yusuf is asking, does HDCP introduce delay in the signal chain?
Not to my knowledge. It's nothing that's going to be noticeable. I mean, the encryption and decryption process theoretically takes some extra time, but it's negligible. It's nothing you'll be able to measure.
Yeah, so the handshaking process might take half a second or a second more, but once it's established, then it works on the fly, basically.
Yeah, in terms of
Maybe
the
a few
signal,
pixels of delay.
yeah, in terms of the signal latency, it's nothing to be concerned about.
Yeah. All right, Daniel is asking, while it is possible to read out the EDID without having a sync device powered, at least with certain devices, is the same possible with the HDCP handshake?
I don't believe so. No, I think you need to have the sync device powered on and a full HDCP authentication to happen. I'm not aware of any device that allows that to happen with an unpowered device.
Yeah, me neither. All right, Dwayne is asking, why does Lightware offer HDCP 2.2 on Wings AV over IP system, while the platform delivers HDMI 1.4, which only supports HDCP 1.4? But it's actually HDMI 2.0 compliant, but the maximum resolution is 4K 30, 60 hertz or 4K 60, 420.
Yeah, so the bandwidth limitation is that of HDMI 1.4, but it actually supports HDMI 2.0 features and technologies.
And Randall is asking, is there a legal way to send HDCP content over SDI?
I do know some cases from specific live events and conferences where people have signed they've got the content producers to sign waivers saying for this specific instance, you're allowed to use it without HDCP. That has happened. From what I understand, it's very difficult to get that to happen. But yeah, in those specific examples, I believe converting to SDI was part of the reason they went with that, rather than just trying to use HDCP compliant devices all the way through the signal path. There was some element of it being necessary to use SDI. It's a tricky one because there are breaker devices that everyone knows about. I mean, HD Fury basically made that's their whole business model, is breaking HDCP. Yes, it's illegal. They get fined. They pay the fine, and then they make a new device that does the same thing. So there are ways of getting around it, but as a manufacturer, it's a bit of a dangerous game.
Yeah, and SDI doesn't have a backwards communication channel, so it's a one-way communication. So there's no EDID pass-through, no HDCP handshake. All right, I think getting back to the most common problems and solutions with HDCP, Vikas is asking, to eliminate ambient electromagnetic noise, is shielded UTP the right cable?
Yes, ambient electromagnetic noise. So from the environment, if you shield the cable, you can eliminate that. However, what that doesn't take care of is the crosstalk between the wire pairs inside the cable. So you need shielding not only from the external environment, but also internally within the cable. That's actually something I think we'll be covering tomorrow, talking about HDBase-T and some of the cables and connector stuff. In terms of Cat-X cables that most represent the same internal structure as DVI and HDMI cables, you want something that's both screened and foiled. So it's SFTP that I would recommend.
All right, I think we have time for one last question. Rajesh is asking, does the handshake happen at the time of the devices are connected, or at the time the content is played?
I believe it's the time when it's connected. It's part of that initial EDID basic handshaking. So it happens at that stage. Whether HDCP, I have seen some devices where that behaved a bit weird with HDCP. I had one display where it wouldn't. We were trying to play HDCP content to it, and it wouldn't work unless I forced HDCP to be on, and then it authenticated, and then it would work. So I had to turn it on our device, on some of the outputs on our device. You can force HDCP to always be on, and I had to turn that on and then off again, and then it would play the content. So it should happen at the basic handshake in the beginning, but with HDCP, you do find some devices handling it in strange ways, which is kind of why it's such a annoying and difficult thing to work with sometimes.
Yeah. All right, I think that's it. I just want to assure everybody that we are going to have a follow-up email after this event where we collect all the questions which could be relevant to everybody, and we are going to send the answers in a follow-up email to everybody who has attended. So no questions will remain unanswered.
Great. Well, thanks, Tibor, and thanks everyone for coming on to the call, and Phil also in there somewhere. And yeah, hopefully that was interesting for everyone. If you have any other follow-up questions, feel free to reach out and get in touch. And yeah, tomorrow we'll be doing part 3, which is HDBase-T, the basics of fiber optics, and then we end with a little bit on display.